got a $400,000 net worth at 34 years old, and I didn't do it with real estate. I don't have an inheritance. I didn't grow up rich. I didn't hit the lottery, and I didn't marry rich either. So in this video, I want to talk about how I did it with no BS and just the basic money habits that I built along the way. Now listen, before we get into it, I feel like I have to say this because I know that $400,000 is not the most money on YouTube or the internet. I know people have done it a lot faster than I have, but for me, I'm really proud of where I've gotten to because just back in 2019, I had a negative $70,000 net worth and I really didn't know the first thing about money, let alone investing, let alone even I hadn't even mastered the art of budgeting yet. Back in 2019, it was a few months after I had my come to Jesus moment where I was like, okay, I'm in a bad situation. I had credit card debt from an ex who had used my credit cards to fund his business. And it wasn't the first time that had happened either. And so I was looking around at the situation that I was in. I was tired of living paycheck to paycheck, had about $70,000 of debt. And I was just kind of like, man, I don't want this to be the rest of my life. I don't want this to be what my story is. And the mantra of my life that has gotten me through so many things, including learning how to money, is dumber people than you have figured it out before. So with that mantra in mind, I decided, you know what? Dumber people than me have figured out how to be good with money. So why don't I just give it a shot? Why don't I just figure this out? And off I went into the money world. What I didn't expect is that I'd become super obsessed with it. And by coming super obsessed with it and having a very laser-like focus on improving my finances, I was able to take my net worth from negative $70,000 back in 2018, 2019, and now I've got a net worth of about $400,000, depending on what the stock market is doing on any given day. So that's about a $500,000 difference in about 6 years. And so I'm pretty proud of it, especially because I never really thought I could do this. I thought I would just be broke forever and live paycheck to paycheck forever. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the exact strategy that I use in order to go from negative $70,000 to $400,000 by the age of 34 years old, including some investing strategy, mindset shifts, and some mistakes that I made along the way as well. All right, so let's get into it. So if we rewind it back to the moment where I had my come to Jesus moment where I was like, I cannot continue to live this way anymore, I had no idea what to do. I didn't know what my first step was. And so I decided what I was going to do is I was just going to journal about what I was spending my money on every day. I got out like a teeny tiny notebook like this and I brought it with me everywhere and I just wrote down every single time that I spent money. Then after 2 weeks, I went through and I started categorizing things just to get a better idea of where my money was actually going. And let me tell you, I was shocked by what I saw. I was shocked, confused, in awe, disgusted. What I realized is I was spending like $600 to $700 every 2 weeks on eating out and drinking and like essentially being hungover. Now, this was way back before when I'm sober now. I don't do the alcohol anymore. But I was so shocked by that because if you had asked me what my values were at the time, I would have told you that I valued travel, I valued family and friends, I valued spending time with loved ones and doing new adventures and new things. But I was spending $600 in 2 weeks on things like drinking, eating out, partying, etc. And granted, I was in my late 20s, so I get that that's kind of part of life at some point, but it disgusted me enough because when I saw that money, it was like, holy crap, $600. If let's say I spent $600 every 2 weeks, that's $1,200 a month. That's money that I could have been putting extra payments on my debt. That's money that I could have been investing. That's money that I could have eventually built my emergency fund, which I definitely didn't have at the time. That was money that I could have been using for a trip to Berlin to see my best friend. And so I just kind of realized, whoa, I actually have resources here, but I'm not using the resources in a way that's actually aligned with what I say my values are. And that did not feel good. So what I decided to do is to continue tracking my money so that I could start building more of an awareness around where my money was going, because I thought I knew where my money was going. I thought it was just like, oh, my money's going to bills. But turns out I was totally wrong. And it was a good thing that I was wrong because I realized I do have resources. The resources just aren't being used in an effective way. So the first thing I did is I tracked every dollar that I spent, and then I created what's called a zero-based budget. Now, a zero-based budget isn't for everybody. I totally get it, but I do think it's a really helpful thing to use, especially if you're new to managing money. You don't have to use it forever because I know there's a lot of people who do not like tracking dollars, but the reason that I recommend trying something like a zero-based budget, which by the way, if you go to the notes down below, I have a link to my free guide where I give you a tutorial on how to make a zero-based budget, including a video and a template. It's totally free. You can grab it down below where it says the Get Your Money Right guide. But anyway, the reason that I think it's a really good idea for people to start with a zero-based budget is because We want to go from never thinking about our money other than maybe just stressing about our money to seeing money as a tool and as something that we have control over. An app is not going to give you that level of intention and that level of hands-onness that you need to really shift your mindset and how you view money. So that's why I'm a really big fan of the zero-based budget. Again, if you want a free template and you want some tutorials on how to create a zero-based budget, that's the budget that I use to this day. I've got a link for you down in the caption or down in the notes. On YouTube, do we call it a caption? Do we call it notes? I don't even know. The show notes? So anyway, that was the first thing I did. I got on a zero-based budget, and I'm going to let you in on a secret. You are going to fuck it up. Like, you are straight up going to fuck it up for the first couple of months that you do a budget, and that's totally normal and not a reason to give up on your budgeting journey. Because here's the thing. Whenever we're learning a new skill, we're not expecting ourselves to be perfect at it right away, right? So for some reason, when it comes to budgeting and other things like that, we often expect ourselves to be perfect at it at the first go. And then when we're not and we fail and we go over budget and we make some mistakes, we're like, well, clearly I just can't budget. That is not true. It took me about 8 months. I'm not kidding. It took me about 8 months of tracking my money and using my little spreadsheet that, again, I have down in the show notes. Again, show notes, question mark. It took me about 8 months before I was finally able to fall into the rhythm of really, really understanding how to budget in a way that worked for me. So I just want to let you know that you're going to mess it up, and that's totally okay. Now, after I figured out the whole budgeting thing, the next thing that I really focused on was increasing my income as much as possible. To be honest, I was kind of already on the journey of focusing on increasing my income as much as possible before I was even good with money. Because way back in 2015, when I got my first corporate girly job, even though it was a nonprofit, it wasn't a corporate girly job, I started to realize how easy it was for me to get promoted at my workplace because I was really good at getting a lot of work done in a short period of time. And so my very first corporate girly job, I got promoted the first year, and then I got promoted every 6 months to a year after that. From 2015 to 2021, I focused heavily on increasing my income as much as possible. 2015 was before I was good at managing money. I was just focusing on how do I make more money because I was living paycheck to paycheck. And so I thought the solution to all my problems was let me just make more money. But as I got promoted, every year that I got promoted or every 6 months that I got promoted and I made more money, somehow that money managed to find its way right out of my pocket. I would do things like buy a new car so that I'd go from having no car payment to having a $350 plus car payment, which now sounds like a steal because cars are so expensive now. I would upgrade my apartment. I'd have fewer roommates. I'd do more travel. I'd start shopping more. And so now I went from $42,000 to about $70,000 between 2015 and 2018. And then in 2018, I switched jobs and I got a new job. And I switched jobs and I started making $90,000 a year. And by the time I quit in 2021, I was making $130,000 a year. That's a huge growth between 2015 making $42,000 and 2021 making $130,000. But I was so laser-like focused on increasing my income as much as possible, especially once I started managing my money back in 2018, 2019, because I knew that if I wanted to retire, if I wanted to invest more money, if I wanted to make faster progress on my financial goals, well, I needed to budget. I needed to do all of these things. I needed to invest in things like that. But what I really needed to put the gas to the pedal or the pedal to the metal was increase my income so I had more resources to dedicate to the financial goals that I had. And so that was a really big thing that I focused on was what were the ways that I was able to get promoted? How was I able to work with my boss to see what I needed to do to get promoted? And then eventually when there was no longer growth opportunities or not enough growth opportunities for me at the company that I was at, when was it time for me to leave? Not only that, in that time frame from 2015 all the way to 2021, I was very often a side hustler. So I've done a ton of different side hustles. Let me know if you want a video about side hustles down in the comments, but I've done all types of side hustles. I've been a babysitter and a nanny. I've been a translator. I've been a writer, a freelance writer. I've been a teacher. I've been a tutor. I drove Uber. I did social media management. I've done so many things. And eventually Clover, this thing that you're watching right now, started as a side hustle. Think about increasing the income as something that I was doing throughout this process because it absolutely was a heavy focus for me. Now, the second thing that I did is I started educating myself about everything I could when it came to money. I ended up enrolling in and taking a certified financial planning course, which was like a $5,000 investment because I thought maybe I wanted to be a CFP. I ended up doing the entire coursework, decided that I didn't want to become a CFP, but not only that, I was listening to all the books and listening to all the podcasts and watching all the YouTube videos to not only learn, but keep the motivation going. Because once you decide to start this journey where you're learning about money, you want to have that emotional high of feeling motivated all the time and really immersing yourself into the world of money, because that's what's going to keep you motivated for the long term. And what really motivated me was not only learning about it, but seeing other people's stories who had started in similar situations that I were and were making progress faster at the same rate, whatever, than I was as well. So that's really key, is create yourself a little podcast or YouTube playlist so that you can really start to dive deep into learning how to money and keep yourself motivated along the way. You don't have to be a financial expert in order to be good with money, but you do have to do a little bit of education so that you can find all the tips and tricks and hacks that will work for you. If you want some free resources in that free guide that I mentioned down below, we also have a list of all my favorite resources that I used when I was learning myself too. And then of course, this page is going to be a resource for you too. You can follow my Instagram as well, where I talk about money daily. Now, the third thing that I did is I made some money goals, and money goals were really important because they keep you motivated along the journey. And originally my money goal, which ended up being a mistake, is my main goal when I first started this entire journey was I just want to be debt free by 33. That was the biggest goal. And so what I did is I started throwing all the extra money that I had onto my debt every single month, even though my debt interest rate, I refinanced my student loans twice, and my interest rate on my debt was 3.54% interest rate. It started at around like 8 or 9%, which if your debt's 8 or 9%, that's a higher priority. It makes sense for you to pay it off a little bit earlier or to try to pay it off early. But once you get below 5% or even below 7%, that debt, it doesn't make sense to pay that off early. Like I said, my debt was at 3.54%, and yet I still paid $40,000 of it off in 2 years because I thought that the key to financial freedom was just being debt free. I didn't realize that that's only one part of the equation when we want to be wealthy. And here's the thing. Being debt-free is not a requirement to building wealth. And I thought it was the ultimate thing because when I grew up, my parents were constantly stressed about credit card debt. They refinanced their home multiple times to pay off credit card debt. And they were just constantly talking about the stress of debt. And so I thought debt is bad, debt is dumb, debt is not something that I want. And so I focused all my energy on paying that off, when in reality, I would have been better off investing it. But you live and you learn, and you don't necessarily know what you don't know. I do talk about this more in depth and I share some of the numbers. I essentially missed out on $1 million of potential opportunity costs in the stock market by paying off $40,000 of debt, low interest rate debt in 2 years. I don't want you to make the same mistake. I talk about that in my free investing class. I will link that down below. But essentially what I realized as I was paying off that debt is I was continuing to educate myself about money. And as I continued to learn more about money, I kept reading about this investing thing, and I kept seeing all this stuff about how I should be investing as soon as possible, as quickly as possible. And I was still in my 20s at the time. And so the more and more I read about investing, even though I kept my blinders on for 2 years because I was so nervous about investing, I didn't think I was smart enough to invest. I didn't think that it was a good idea. I eventually, by the time 2020 rolled around, mid-year 2020, I was like, Chloe, you can't ignore this anymore. And the next thing I did is I focused on I stopped focusing on debt freedom and I started investing money instead. All right, so it was 2020 when I finally had the decision, okay, I need to stop focusing so much on just paying off my debt, and instead I need to be focusing on investing. Now, I failed to mention that before this happened, back in, I want to say it was 2019, I had an ex-boyfriend who was a bit of a scam artist, but I didn't know it at the time, who was flipping houses in the Chicago area. And while I was starting to get my money together in 2019, I finally had saved up $5,000, and it was like my entire savings. And so what did I do? I decided to invest it in his company in flipping properties in Chicago. And anytime that I supposedly made money from that investment, he would ask me, hey, do you want me to pay you back out, or do you want to reinvest the money? So for example, if I made 20% on that $5,000, that's $1,000. And he would either offer to pay me that back, to pay me that $6,000, or I could reinvest that $6,000. So pretty much every time I said, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and reinvest that money. And oh, here, by the way, here's some extra money that I I have that I would love for you to reinvest into the business. And so I did that month after month after month. And eventually I had a bunch of money invested with him. By the time 2020 rolled around, I probably had, I think I had about $50,000 invested with him. And 2020, we all know what happened. Things got weird. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But first, 2020 was also the year that I decided, okay, it's time for me to work on actually investing in the stock market. I can't just be investing in this guy's business. I need to also learn how to invest in the stock market, especially because investing in this dude's business is highly risky and seems too good to be true. Wink, wink. I started learning everything that I could about investing, and eventually I decided, all right, it's time. I logged into my 401k, I went in and I chose my own investments, and then I pressed okay, went off into the investing land and was like, oh, okay, it didn't go down to zero. I think I'm doing all right. I continued my education, and eventually I learned about these things called index funds, which I talk about index funds in my free class. I'll leave a link to that down in the show notes, caption, etc. And so I logged back into my 401k and I was like, none of these investments that I picked were actually index funds. And so I went in, made a few changes, and boom, I was invested in index funds the lazy way. Now, because I was kind of lazy with it and I didn't really know enough about investing in other things like Roth IRAs or traditional IRAs or HSAs, what I did at the time when I was still learning is I just focused on increasing my contributions to my 401k as much as possible. Back in 2020, that was the very first year that I completely maxed out my 401k. It's also the year that I got anything more than just the employer match that I was given, but I believe at the time the maximum that you could put into your 401k was around $22,000. I did that and it was the coolest thing ever because I had never invested that much money and I was finally building my net worth. That's not usually what most finance creators or finance experts recommend you do. Usually people recommend that you first max out something like a Roth IRA because your investments inside of the Roth IRA grow tax-free. But one of the things that I think is really underrated is the fact that when we're a new investor, we need something that's really easy and really automated that we know for sure is actually getting invested. And for a lot of us, that's our 401k. The biggest hack that you can do when it comes to your finances is making it so that it's impossible for you to not invest. And so for me, the money was just getting pulled right out of my paycheck before I ever had an opportunity to spend that money, which was huge. And then there was this added bonus of the fact that when I put money into the 401k, it was a traditional 401k, it reduced my taxable burden significantly. So I think I was making about, let's see, in 2020, I was probably making about 100k a year-ish. I was probably making slightly above 100k a year. So if I put 100k a year in, but I put $20,000 into my 401k, that means that instead of me paying taxes on 100k of income, I actually only paid taxes on 80k of income. So that was some really significant tax savings. And again, it was super easy. All I had to do was crank up my investments, crank up my contributions to my 401k, and that was it. I didn't have to do anything else. Again, when you're a new investor, that's one of the best things that you can do because it's automated. You don't have to think about it. For the most part, you know that it's getting invested. And again, it just takes the thinking out of it. You're treating it like a bill. It's just automatically happening. Now, 2020 was also a time that I finally decided, okay, I really need to get the emergency fund in place. I had spent the first 2 years of my journey thinking that credit cards were just as good as having an emergency fund because I had a high paying job. And so I just figured, oh, well, if I have to go into credit card debt because of an emergency, I'll just pay it off with my high income. The pandemic, I think, showed us all that a secure job is not an emergency fund and credit cards are not an emergency fund. And so that was the year where I finally decided, okay, I have to get 3 months emergency savings as a priority. And so while I switched from that debt-free mindset to the wealth building mindset, not only was I focusing on saving up an emergency fund in 2020, but I was also focusing on increasing my investment. For those of you who are unaware, an emergency fund is really just 3 months of your emergency expenses saved in something like a high yield savings account. The recommendation is between 3 and 6 months. 3 months is if you're a dual income household, you have 2 incomes. And so you can, if one of you lost an income, you will have the other income and the 3 months will kind of support you in the time where you're not making as much or you don't have that income. And 6 months is the recommendation if you're a single income household, or even if you are a self-employed person, or if you're in a risky job, or if you have health problems and things like that and sometimes have to take time off of work. Honestly, I think it doesn't hurt for all of us to have closer to a 6-month emergency fund, especially as we're facing things like a recession. As I mentioned, 2020 was also the year where things started to get fishy with my real estate investment. So I had put this money in with my ex-boyfriend where he was supposedly using the money to flip properties in Chicago, but this was the time where labor costs started going up as well as lumber costs. And so he was supposed to pay me out, and it just never happened. So every month I'd be checking in with him and I'd be like, hey, when am I going to get a payout for this $50,000? Hey, when is it coming? And this went on for almost 2 years before I finally was like, okay, I'm just not getting this money back. And it's a really, really hard lesson that I have to learn. Total amount was about $55,000, $56,000. He still owes me that to this day. But I'm never going to see a dollar of it. I'm pretty sure he's bankrupt, but it's kind of a flex to be like, yeah, I lost $50,000 and it didn't hurt me. Like, I'm totally fine. Would it be nice to have a $450,000 net worth right now? And honestly, if I had that $50,000, I would have invested it in the stock market. And so it would probably be, I don't know, $100,000 by now. So would it be nice to have a $500,000 net worth by now? Yes, it would. But is it a low-key flex that I lost that money and I still made all this progress in the years from 2019 to 2025? Also, yes. But you know, best of luck to him. Well, yeah, I think, you know, that's all. So anyway, like I said, 2020 was the year I started investing in the stock market really aggressively. And then by 2021, I started prioritizing other vehicles of investing as well. It wasn't just my 401k. I was also using my IRA, my first year doing a Roth IRA. I started using an HSA as well. And so I was investing like crazy. That was really my main goal, was to get as much money into the stock market as humanly possible. 2021 was also the year that I took my CFP and started learning everything that I could about money from the professionals. Again, I decided I didn't want to become a CFP and I'd rather be an educator instead. 2021 was the year that I finally decided to start taking content creation seriously. I had dabbled in content creation since on and off since 2017. I had a mental health blog that I had done a little bit of work on that I was really enjoying writing back in 2017 and 2018. And then when I decided to start learning about money, I also started sharing my journey on that blog. I wasn't really a great blogger though, so even though I was a decent writer, I didn't really understand all the SEO and things like that. So in 2021, after having spent about 3 years dabbling in the content creation space via blogs and YouTube and an occasional Instagram post, I decided, you know what, I'm gonna stop focusing on all of these different channels, and I'm just gonna really dedicate a lot of time to Instagram and TikTok. I'm going to take it really seriously, give it everything that I got. And then if in a year from now it doesn't turn into anything, I'll reevaluate and decide whether or not I want to continue doing it. In March 2021, Chloe Bear Money Coach was born, and I started doing some one-on-one coaching with folks on how to improve their finances, like budgeting and learning how to invest and things along those lines as well. And my roster of availability for clients one-on-one booked out within 24 hours of me announcing sessions available every single time. So every single month I would raise my prices, open up the calendar for the 30 days of which I had coaching available, and it would sell out again within 24 hours. And so every single month I started to realize, holy cow, this could be a really viable thing for me to do full time, but I need to figure out how to help more people and do it in a way where I'm not coaching 60 people a month, because 60 people a month was like 120 hours of work. And mind you, I was doing that while also working a full-time job. But in that time frame, when I was still working a full-time job and I was doing this as a side hustle, helping people one-on-one with their money, I was making a significant amount of money. And so I was throwing about 75% of my income into my investments, paying down my debt, and saving for an emergency fund and things along those lines. Once I started to realize it wasn't sustainable for me to continue to work my full-time job, continue to create a ton of content, and also working with one-on-one clients, I decided, okay, I really think it's time for me to quit my job to pursue this full-time. And so I made a plan to quit my job. And my plan to quit my job was I wanted to make a minimum of $5,000 a month, because I knew I could live off of $5,000 a month, but I wanted to make that minimum for 6 months before I even considered quitting my job. And I also wanted to have a year emergency fund before I quit my job. Year emergency fund is definitely not a requirement. I do think that if you want to quit your job to pursue something full-time or pursue your own business full-time, you do want to have a minimum of a 6-month emergency fund. Businesses come with a lot of ups and downs, and some of them can also have a lot of expenses in the beginning. And so you want to make sure that you're in a good position that if you are going to leave your job to try this full-time, then you want to have a buffer, and you want to make sure that you're able to handle the ups and downs when it comes to the income that you may or may not have, especially in the first year. So I hit those goals by October 2021. And once I was able to quit my job to focus on Chloe Bear full time, my income skyrocketed, the business skyrocketed, the Lazy Investors course was born, and it's been a whirlwind for the past 4 years. And now that I've been full time in this content creator role for the last 4 years, I continue to do all of these steps that we've talked about. I continue to work on investing as much as possible. I work on saving for things well in advance as well. the basics don't change. The things that aren't a priority for me right now is I have not been focusing on paying off my debt early because, again, right now I think it's less than $2,000 and I have like 2 more months in which I have to pay it off, but the interest rates are 3.54%. So if I had an extra $2,000, I'm throwing that into the stock market instead of putting it onto my debt. But now I focus on maxing out my solo 401k, which is basically the same thing as a regular 401k. I also focus on maxing out an IRA, and I'm also using a taxable brokerage as well. I'm still using the same lazy strategy that I've been using all these years. I'm investing in index funds, which, again, if you want to learn about index funds, let me know in the comments or check out my free class that I'll link down in the caption. But it's really just the same stuff rinsed and repeated with a couple of changing priorities as life comes and goes. Like one of my priorities now, I'm saving a lot more money in cash than I used to back in 2020, 2021, because I'm trying to save for a house, I'm trying to save for a wedding, I'm trying to save for having kids in a couple of years as well. And all of those things require a little bit more cash. Before we close out this video, one of the things that I really want to talk about is the mindset shifts that I've had to make along the way. There's been a lot of mindset shifts that I have had to face from the beginning and every single new step that I achieved. The very first mindset shifts that I had to make was this idea that money is a tool that I actually have control of, and that money is something that I have to learn how to be good with. I'm not just born good with it or born bad. I think that's something that a lot of us think, that money is either a skill that you have or you don't have, but in reality, it's not a character flaw if you're not good with money. It just means you haven't learned the skill set, which most of us don't learn anything about money in high school or grade school or even in college unless we decide to opt into a personal finance class, which I didn't even know that was available, and I certainly didn't think it was something that I'd be interested in or even able to understand. So I just want to really highlight the fact that if you're here and you're watching this video and you're thinking, I just can't do any of this because I'm bad with money, I tell you what, I was stinking bad with money back in the day as well, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in my free class that I mentioned down below. The other big mindset shift that I really had to make, and this is actually one that I had to make back in 2015 when I first entered into corporate America, was this idea that the amount of money that you can make is unlimited. However, the amount of money that you can cut back on when it comes to your spending is limited. You can only cut back so much and still maintain a standard of living that works for you. I would much rather focus on increasing my income as much as possible while maintaining really good money habits, because again, the amount of money that you can make is unlimited, but the amount of money that you can cut back, well, cutting back, number one, isn't that much fun, and number two, it's not sustainable if you're cutting out all the joy of your budget. So of course we want to have a budget. Of course we want to be using a budget in order to maintain our finances and keep our eye on the prize. But what we really want to be focusing our time and energy into is figuring out how to make as much money as possible. So if you want tips on how to make as much money as possible, that's something that I can definitely do some more videos on. I feel like I'm a money-making mad woman. But let me know what questions you have down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I'm going to try to do more YouTube videos the second half of the year. So here we go. We're going to do it even if it's not perfect. We're going to do it even if it's not got all the fancy editing and things like that. And you know, I'll figure it out as I go. I'm a huge believer in just doing the thing and figuring it out as you go. And so YouTube's kind of going to be that thing for me. So thank you guys for being here, and I'll see you